Well, let's bring in our guests now for today's Inside Story. From Manila is Harry Roque, a lawyer and former spokesman for President Duterte and a former member of Congress. In San Diego, California, in the U.S., Richard Heydarian, a political scientist and author of The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy. And also in Manila, Danilo Arao, journalism professor at the University of the Philippines. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us on Inside Story. Harry Roque in Manila, let me start with you. You were President Duterte's spokesman once. You've known him for a long time. What is his government's real motivation in wanting to shut down ABS-CBN?
Well, let me first correct your reporting. No? The president has clarified through his current spokesperson that he has nothing to do with the quo warranto petition filed by the Office of the Solicitor General. Under the Philippine Constitution, the Philippine Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over these kinds of petition, and under Rule 66 of the Revised Rules of Court, the OSG is in fact authorized to file these petitions. Now, having said that, I don't think the petition will prosper anyway. It is in the nature of a prior restraint, and in our jurisprudence, all prior restraints come to court with a heavy presumption of unconstitutionality. So, short of a clear and present danger, I don't think the Supreme Court will act on the petition, especially since the life of the franchise of ABS-CBN is only until March 30. My earliest prediction is that the court will not act on it until the franchise of ABS-CBN expires, in which case it becomes moot and academic and not ripe for judicial determination.
All right, let me bring in Danilo Arao in Manila. You don't seem to agree with Harry, Danilo, when he says that this petition has nothing to do with President Duterte, that President Duterte had nothing to do with the petition.
Yeah, it has everything to do with Duterte, because we just need to realize that as early as 2017, in his second State of the Nation address, he identified 3 news media organizations, including ABS-CBN, for either the critical reportage that they provide to the public, as well as allegations of foreign ownership. And besides, the Office of the Solicitor General acts in behalf of the government, and we cannot deny the fact that Duterte is the head of the executive department, even if there is clear control also of the legislature and the judicial branches of government. So Jose Calida, who is currently the Philippines Solicitor General, would definitely be receiving marching orders from Malacanang.
Does the president then, are you saying that the president calls the shots when it comes to media regulation?
Of course he does, because he's the president, number one. And of course, second of all, he has a lot to gain from the closure, if ever, of ABS-CBN. It's not just simply a vendetta. He already stated publicly that he would prefer that the Lopezes, who currently own ABS-CBN, would just simply sell ABS-CBN, and that things will be fine. And on another occasion, he was even quoted as saying that for as long as ABS-CBN will support federalism, which is one of the thrusts of the Duterte administration, he is willing to forgive ABS-CBN for whatever alleged transgressions. So, of course, in the court of law, Harry may say that these are just circumstantial evidence, that these are irrelevant. But in the court of public opinion and in the struggle for media freedom, all of these things mean a lot. And we see right now the convergence toward the probable denial of the request for the renewal of franchise of ABS-CBN.
All right, Richard Heydarian, your thoughts on this?
I think there's just too much imagination in that comment. I think the president has gone on record that he leaves it to Congress whether or not to renew the franchise of ABS-CBN, and under a constitution, that is in fact a sole exclusive prerogative of the House of Representatives. And then he makes a big issue about the concept of doctrine of qualified political agency. In this instance, the president has expressly said that he had nothing to do with that petition. And under the rules of court, Rule 66, there would be dereliction of duty on the part of the Solicitor General if, in his belief, there is a violation of the franchise and he does nothing about it.
Okay.
So let's not automatically conclude that any act of a cabinet is the act of the president, because the qualified political agency says exactly that. It's qualified until ratified or rejected by the president. And in this instance, the president has said, I had nothing to do with that.
Okay, Richard Heydarian, let me
The
bring you
same-
into the conversation. Gentlemen, let's just allow Richard to also give his thoughts on this issue. Richard, Harry says the president has nothing to do with this petition. Our guest, Danilo in the Philippines, says, no, he does, and he's being vengeful. Where do you stand on this? What do you think is going on here?
Well, as a political scientist, my job is to compare different countries, especially fledgling democracies, over time. And I think it would be quite naive and fanciful to assume that in countries like the Philippines, which is a fledgling democracy, you have a complete and absolute rule of law. I think it's very difficult to separate the exercise of law from political interest in countries like the Philippines. So this is something that it will be very hard to deny. At the same time, of course, we know that any kind of attack or move against media like ABS-CBN, this is not the first time that it's happening. Even after the collapse of the Marcos dictatorship, we had other presidents in the Philippines like President Estrada and other populists, and at some point popular president who was also very critical of the ABS-CBN. And I think the GMA administration also in the past was quite critical of the ABS-CBN. So President Duterte is not the first president in recent memory in the Philippines who has gone against ABS-CBN or at least accused ABS-CBN of having certain bias against it. So in some ways, as shocking as this is also not surprising.
So,
the other thing we have to keep in mind is President Duterte is also very unique for his decisive character. This is a person who has effectively ended the Philippines' alliance with the United States, which has been there for 100 years by abrogating unilaterally and perfunctorily the Visiting Forces Agreement. So with that kind of president, in that kind of context, I think to talk about absolute rule of law is a bit fanciful. What we should talk about is rule by law, whereby sometimes the law is actually a reflection of the interests of who occupies the throne.
President Duterte has had a particularly
I'm sorry, I don't
tense
agree that we
relations.
are a fledgling democracy. I don't think we agree. I agree that we have a fledgling democracy. We gave people power not only to the Middle East, but to the rest of the world. And not only that, our jurisprudence in free speech and in the freedom of the press is very well established. Regardless of who the leader is, that jurisprudence remains. And that is why my fearless prediction is the OSG can file it, but it is subject to a heavy... Excuse me, I'm still speaking. Good manners. I waited for you to finish your statement. But I think the rule of law in the Philippines will prevail. And even if the SOGEN filed it, as I said, my prediction is, because it is in the nature of prior restraint, it will not prosper.
But let me just ask you, Harry, I mean, the government, as Danilo and Richard both said, have used the same accusation about foreign ownership against the news website Rappler, which in 2018 had its license revoked. And that decision is under appeal now. When you look at the things that have been happening over the last few years, over the last 3 years that President Rodrigo Duterte has been in power, it doesn't really show a positive image. I mean, the media seems to be under pressure in the Philippines. How do you explain this?
Well, don't be confused, because the case of ABS-CBN is different from Rappler. In the first place, the ABS-CBN's depository instrument was approved by the SEC, and Rappler's was not. And the reason being, in the case of Rappler, the Philippine SEC said that Rappler gave foreigners control, particularly on the issue of whether or not to continue with the business, which is tantamount to control and therefore violative of the Philippine Constitution, saying that media business can only owned by Filipino citizens. And that is why, again, my fearless prediction is, although this was used as a ground by the Office of the Solicitor General, it will not prosper, precisely because the same administrative agency that ruled that Rappler violated the Constitution approved the issuance of this depository instrument, and therefore carries with it the burden of proof of regularity, or the fact that the administrative body who is most authorized and most competent in these matters have said that there was no violation of the Constitution.
All right. So you seem to say that due process will be followed by Congress and the Supreme Court. Danilo Arau, do you agree with that? Do you think the Supreme Court justices will indeed follow due process in this case of ABS-CBN?
Well, we have to ask ourselves who controls the Supreme Court right now. Of course, people may say, like Harry, that it's a wild imagination, but whether or not the case will prosper, it is still a form of harassment and intimidation against the media. That's the bottom line. Maria Ressa mentions the sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, and the culture of impunity is really there. We need to remember that what is happening to Rappler, ABS-CBN, and even the Philippine Daily Inquirer these present a chilling effect on the other news media organizations, and it's quite reminiscent of martial law. Because during martial law, it's not as if all media organizations were harassed and intimidated. Only the so-called alternative media or mosquito press were subjected to various forms of censorship. But history would show that the dictatorship really suppressed the media. So you don't, in other words, you don't need to harass all the media. You just need to make an example out of a handful of them, and one of them is ABS-CBN right now. Mm-hmm. And there are dangerous pronouncements being made by Duterte's allies, particularly House Speaker Alan Peter Cayetano, whenever he says that even GMA and TV5 would be investigated because they allegedly also have PDRs, or Philippine Depositary Receipts.
Okay.
And again, we need to fact check all of these things because even the Philippine Stock Exchange defines PDRs as not being tantamount to ownership, and that these are just simply investment instruments. But the twisting of the facts as well as the framing by the government would claim otherwise, and
Richard,
that's why people are up in arms, including journalists and media workers. That would partly explain why every Friday we're always at ABS-CBN grounds to make
when you say people are up in arms, let me just ask you this. I mean, most polls have shown that the president's policies are very popular with Filipinos. His war on drugs remain popular with Filipinos, and he's urged the public not to believe the media. So is he winning this battle of public opinion when it comes to the media?
Okay, as far as the surveys are concerned, we need to look at it quite succinctly, because it's true that he enjoys popular support, but that has been the case whenever terms are just during the first half, because in the Philippines the term of office is 6 years. It's within the first 3 years, of course, you still enjoy relatively high popularity. And besides, when we look at the trend, insofar as authoritarian regimes are concerned, definitely they enjoy popularity at the start. Even Adolf Hitler had more than 90% popularity rating during the first few years of the Third Reich. So it's not as if this is something new.
Okay,
and
Richard,
one of the things
let me bring in Richard. I get your point.
I think that's a stretch, no?
Okay.
I think that's a stretch. Marcos,
Harry,
I don't think had the same kind of popularity as President Duterte.
Harry, stand by. I'll come to you in just a minute.
Okay.
Let me just bring in Richard back to the conversation. Richard, Duterte has been president for 3 years now in the Philippines. Where does this case and the others against the media leave freedom of speech in the Philippines? Is it headed towards an even more dangerous path?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we have to give due credit to the Times. I mean, you finally have a ruling or a verdict on the Maguindanao massacre, which has been lingering there for quite some time, almost a decade. So there are some positive developments there. And let's not forget, one of the reasons why the Philippines was considered as one of the most dangerous places for journalists in the past was because of the Maguindanao massacre a decade ago. So we have a ruling on that. Second, yes, there are concerns about chilling effect on the media, but as someone who has been in a wide range of countries from North Korea to China, parts of the Middle East, and also in the West, I could say that the Philippines overall, if you look at the editorial line of major newspapers and major media networks, some of them that I work with, I don't see any sign of editorial censorship by the bigger ones, the more prominent ones. In fact, you could see more critical statements about President Duterte's quite prominently across the Philippine media. So while I think there are concerns that the Philippines is going in the wrong direction, or that there could be a chilling effect, as far as the editorial line of major newspapers is concerned, I still do not see that. But that doesn't mean that we should not worry about anything. President Duterte is popular. He's still the commander-in-chief. He has a very strong support. And I think we should also not forget, not only in the mainstream media, but also in social media and alternative media, how the supporters of the president are very aggressive, very assertive, and they're, at least there are fears that, the attack on mainstream media or personalities from mainstream media is not confined only to the court of law, but could extend also to the alternative media. So we're talking about a much more hybrid, much more liquid, and I think gray zone situation rather than black and white dictatorship versus full democracy situation.
All right, Harry, your thoughts now. You had quite a few things you wanted to add to what Richard and Danilo have been saying. Go ahead, please.
Well, I was one of those who prosecuted successfully the killers of 30 journalists in the Maguindanao massacre. I think that proves that we have a working legal system. It's not perfect. It took 10 years to convict. It should have taken a shorter period of time. I've been working with journalists and media players for my entire career, 29 years of practice as a media lawyer. And I can tell you that as it stands, the jurisprudence in the Philippines recognizes completely freedom of the press. Governments may try to suppress it, but the courts will never uphold any infringement on freedom of the press. I think we have one of the best jurisprudence on freedom of the press. We have lent this to the entire world community. We have used Philippine jurisprudence in the UN Committee on Human Rights to assist journalists in trouble in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Thailand. And the international community has been accepting Philippine jurisprudence. I think we will survive any attempts to suppress freedom of the press precisely because of our rule of law and our jurisprudence upholding the supremacy of freedom of expression and freedom of the press.
Danilo Arroyo, you're a journalism professor. Your response to that?
Yeah, of course, on paper, we have laws protecting freedom of speech and other basic freedoms. But of course, there's freedom of speech and there's freedom after speech. Freedom after speech is a different matter altogether because we may be the freest press in Asia or one of the freest in Asia, but we're one of the most dangerous places in the world to practice journalism. Make no mistake about it, a number of journalists killed from 1986 up to the present. 1986 was supposed to be the time when democracy was restored with the ouster of the Marcoses then in the Philippines. We have, depending on the statistics, the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility pegs it at, if I'm not mistaken, around 164. The National Union of Journalists pegs it at around 185. But regardless of the number, the statistics are quite alarming. While it's true that the Ampatuan massacre case is quite historic and it should be considered as a landmark case, what we have here still is a partial victory. And besides, the decision is a consolidated partial decision. 80 or I think 4 had been apprehended, so around 76 are still at large. And we still need to monitor the case because there's a possibility that the guilty verdict might be appealed to the higher court. So it's still a long drawn-out battle. While we have to be happy with the victory with the Ampatuan massacre, we still cannot ignore the fact that killings are happening and that various forms of harassment and intimidation are also happening. Just recently, one of my friends, the executive director of Eastern Vista, was arrested. She's a journalist, but she's accused of being a high-ranking member of the Communist Party, which is quite baseless because I can vouch for her, legal personality.
Right.
But these things are happening right now.
Okay. Richard Heydarian, let's just come back to the ABS-CBN case. Which side do you think the Supreme Court will side with in this case? And, will there be due process, in your opinion?
Well, the way I would rather put it is this. I mean, I think comparing President Duterte to the likes of Hitler would be a step too much. But I like to compare him rather to people, populist authoritarians like Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, or even some people like Putin in his earlier years. I think the president and his supporters have done a very effective job, including on social media, through the partisans of the administration, that when you talk about mainstream media or independent media, they're not necessarily independent media, but instead they're more a reflection of the interest of the old oligarchy that has been in control of the country. I think that kind of rhetoric has been very effective for President Duterte. And as a populist, he positioned himself as an anti-establishment. And you could see the sentiments on the ground, you can see sentiments on social media, the backlash against perceived or real move against ABS-CBN or other media outlets is not as huge as anyone would have expected. I mean, let's not forget ABS-CBN is a huge conglomerate that is not only composed of news production, but also huge entertainment.
Right.
But we don't see that because I think many people in the Philippines believe that the president is not going against freedom of expression per se, but going against liberal oligarchs who are trying to put blocks or blockages for his agenda of transforming the country. I think that's something to keep in mind. And the Supreme Court is not necessarily above the fray. Again, in fledgling democracies like in the Philippines, they'll also take this broader political context into consideration.
Okay, Harry Roque, I'll give you the last word. I mean, there are thousands of people whose jobs are on the line, are threatened if this license, the ABS, CBN's franchise is not renewed. You know, how will the government deal with the fallout?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between the petition for quo warranto and the franchise. No? As far as the petition for quo warranto is concerned, I think the jurisprudence is established that where an act of government has the effect of prior restraint, then it is presumed unconstitutional. And for this reason, I think the petition will fail.
Okay.
However, because broadcast is covered by a franchise, it is a privilege because it is using airwaves owned by the state. It is not as free as the other medium of mass media. In fact, different courts in different jurisdictions have said that those which are entitled to full protection are the print media and the internet. And in the Philippines, the jurisprudence is that broadcast media, in fact, is subject to the most control because, unfortunately, it is still subject as a prerequisite for the exercise of freedom of the press, the fact that they need a privilege to use the airwaves in the form of a franchise. My fearless prediction is Congress eventually will give them a franchise, and the president, as a lawyer, will respect that.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very lively and interesting discussion. Harry Roque, Danilo Arao, and Richard Heydarian. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. As always, you can watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Fuli Batibo, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.